Good. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. My name is Emily Biggs, and I am the programs manager here. And tonight, I am so delighted to be joined by Selby Schwartz as we discuss her brilliant book, After Sappho. This conversation is organized tonight as part of a larger festival we've put together this month, celebrating the history of literature, music, and sound called Reverberations. So I'll tell you a bit about that. Organized in partnership with the Opéra Comique and with the generous support of Festival Napa Valley and the Florence Gold Foundation, we're delighted to be hosting Reverberations, a festival celebrating literature out loud. For thousands of years, as long as both have existed, in fact, as we will see tonight, poetic and musical traditions have shaped and informed one another, and this month it's been such a pleasure to highlight innovations in the musical arts through a series of conversations, concerts, and workshops with authors and artists coming together to offer synthetic perspectives on the history of storytelling and sound. Please don't hesitate to look at programs for Reverberations, which you'll find up front, to see other upcoming events as we close out this festival. Don't miss them. A couple of notes about this conversation. After about 45 minutes of discussion, we're going to open it up to our in-person audience and to our Zoom audience who's inside that camera right there. Hello, Zoom audience. So if you're on Zoom, feel free to send your questions in through the chat. And if you're in person, sit tight and raise your hand when I tell you to. And finally, we have copies of this remarkable, wonderful book, After Sappho, for sale, thanks to our partner booksellers, Smith & Son. Those are available just out there. And Selby will hopefully be signing some copies. Selby will indeed be signing some copies after this event, so please don't miss out on this opportunity to purchase the remarkable book. On to our brilliant speaker tonight. Selby Wynn Schwartz is the author of After Sappho, which was longlisted for the 2022 Booker Prize and shortlisted for both the 2023 Orwell Prize in Political Fiction and the 2023 James Tate Black Prize in Fiction. Her novella, A Life in Chameleons, received the 2021 Reflex Press Novella Award, and in summer 2024, she will be a fellow at the Maison de Ramar in Minerbes. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from Berkeley University. After Sappho has been described as a joyous reimagining of many lives, as breathlessly, carnally beautiful. It is both a poetic history, a manifesto of the present, a feminist biography, a biography of feminism, and more. It is so delightful and creative and slippery and whimsical that it actually evades description and categorization entirely. And so all we can really do tonight is talk about it. So fortunately, that's what we're here to do. Can I have a big round of applause for Selby, please? Thank you. So to give people who haven't had the chance to read this brilliant book an idea of what it's about, we're going to start with a reading. Selby will be reading the prologue of this book, and then we will dive into discussing what exactly it's about, if indeed it's about anything at all.
Okay, this is from the prologue. Sappho, circa 630 BCE. The first thing we did was change our names. We were going to be Sappho. Who was Sappho? No one knew, but she had an island. She was garlanded with girls. She could sit down to dine and look straight at the woman she loved, however unhappily. When she sang, everyone said, it was like evening on a riverbank, sinking down into the moss with the sky pouring over you. All of her poems were songs. We read Sappho at school in classes intended merely to teach poetic meter. Very few of our teachers imagined that they were swelling our veins with cassia and myrrh. In dry voices, they went on about the aorist tense, while inside ourselves we felt the leaves of trees shivering in the light, everything dappled, everything trembling. We were so young then that we had never met. In back gardens, we read as much as we could, staining our dresses with mud and pine pitch. Some of us were sent by our families to distant schools to be finished, so that we would come to our proper end. But it was not our end. It was merely our beginning. Each one lingered in her own place, searching the fragments of poems for words to say what this was, this feeling that Sappho calls aithousomenon, the way that leaves move when nothing touches them but the afternoon light. At that time, we were not called anything, and so we cherished every word, no matter how many centuries dead. Reading of the nocturnal rites of the Panuccides, we stayed up all night. The exile of Sappho to Sicily turned our eyes to the sea. We began writing odes to clover blossoms and blushing apples, or painting on canvases that we turned to the wall at the slightest sound of footsteps. A sidelong glance, a half smile, a hand that rested on our arms just above the elbow. We had not yet memorized the lines for these occasions, or there were only fragments of lines that we could have offered in any case. Of the 9 books of poems written by Sappho, mere shreds of dactyls survive. As in fragment 24c, we live the opposite, daring. Thank you.
If we haven't already convinced you to buy the book, then I don't know what to say. You can leave now. Selby, it's such a remarkably creative way to start a novel. And the first thing that we notice here is the we itself. This has been described, your use of we, of this first person plural throughout the entire book, has been described as a first person choral. And we know, because the book is called After Sappho and you're talking about Sappho, that we're going to have a bit of ancient Greece in here. And in fact, you're playing with the tradition of the Greek chorus in Greek theater. So can you tell us a bit about who this we is and how they're threaded through the book, how we are threaded through the book?
Yes, I think the way you changed at the end is maybe part of the dynamic, which is, there's a sense in which it's a they, there's a chorus, and in ancient Greek theater, the chorus is set to the side of the stage. The chorus has opinions. The chorus worries. The chorus laments. The chorus, comments. So that's the kind of they, maybe, or the more static role of the chorus. So I wanted there to be a chorus that was a collective, also a collective voice, or a collective of variegated voices. I think of this we as, not all having the same identity exactly, but being an ensemble, being a gathering, being a together. In their diversity, and then I wanted a we, and this was there from the very beginning of the book for reasons I don't understand, but when I started the we was already there. I wanted a we that wasn't static, so a we that could learn, that could change, that could make mistakes, that could begin by being very, very young in the back garden, just solitary and reading and having never met and only learning from books, and become a kind of we that could narrate to switch with you, to narrate our own lives, could write our own lives, and maybe even care for the lives of people whose lives otherwise would not be written or would not be counted as important enough to write. And so that was the we that I tried to write, like changing a chorus from a side they to a center we, and trying to put the chorus in the center so they have the capacity also to act and to change, to become.
And the notion of becoming is so central to the work, and indeed we do see this we sort of learn from what they're processing and start to be able to articulate themselves, speak to who they are. And it's so interesting that you talk about this notion of being static, because in fact the sort of tragedy of the Greek chorus is they're almost outside of time. They're not on the stage. They're not participating. And there's some analogy to be made with that, with the role of women in artistic creation historically, which you were playing with as well. You're bringing women out of the role of the observer who sits and worries and says, "What are you doing? Stop, stop, stop!" And you're allowing them to intervene on the scene, to begin acting. And I want to talk a bit more about the role of theatrics in this book itself, because as we'll see as we get into it, so many of the women whose biographies we encounter in it are actresses, they're playwrights, or they're engaging with the performative arts in some way, but they're also engaging with gender and with sexuality as a performance as well, with the idea of being a woman as a theatrical act. So can you speak to the role of theatrics as you were piecing this work together and uncovering these women?
Yes, I can. Maybe I can try by telling you a story about where it comes from. In a way, it's a story also about this room of people. Yeah. So when I was in graduate school, and I was in graduate school with Tom, who's sitting in the front row here at UC Berkeley, and one of the lovely things about being in this program together is that you could do almost anything you wanted, and nobody really said anything to you about it except, well, that sounds interesting. So all of us got interested in whatever we were interested in, and it was so nice to just have people say, well, that sounds interesting. And then sometimes they would also say, oh, I could teach you a little more about that. And those are the best two things that I think somebody could say. It's interesting, we don't know, but we could teach you, we could help you. And so one of the things I learned a lot about was medieval Occitan poetry, so troubadours and troubadourites and jugglers and juggleresses. I learned to read it in Old Occitan in this life. Yeah, it's amazing people let you do this, but they did. And so I was very interested in that kind of poetry in gender and performance, and in the way that sometimes we don't know the gender of these poets. And often it was assumed, that a poet, that if it was a good poem, it had to be written by a male poet. And there was some contesting about that. And so I went from, thinking about gender and gender performance and the voices of women and the bodies of women performing and people performing regardless of their gender as women or as in the voices of women, to writing an academic book about drag dance, which I also didn't know anything about, in the 20th century in the US. And during that time, I was working for a dance company, doing a lot of tour managing with Lucille, who's sitting in the front row next to Tom. And we worked a lot together touring in France, which is how I learned what French I know. And that was also about, learning from artists, being backstage and watching the sort of the enigmatic and mysterious and somewhat mystical process of people gathering their energies and their talents and their gifts and pouring it out on stage for a public, and the way that a public can absorb that gift. And then I went on to write about early cinema, which I also knew nothing about. This is the refrain. And I didn't know anything about that. I taught myself about early cinema because I was interested in drag. And that's how I learned about Eleonora Duse, the artist, the actress from Italy. And then finally, I learned that she had been in a romantic relationship with Lina Poletti. And then when I learned about Lina Poletti, I sort of fell in love, and that was the beginning, in a way, of this book. So it's very tied to my useless background in things I didn't know about that I loved, and it's tied to a history of admiring what people can do in performance, in the past and in the present, and I tried to pour all of those loves, in whatever maybe incoherent way together into this book.
I love that you keep using the term gathering, because of course when we talk about chorus, the etymological root choros is also about a gathering. It's about an assembling and coming together. And this is a book about gathering after gathering after gathering. The ladies are gathering. The ladies are in the salons. The ladies are talking to one another. They're gathering in the kitchen. This sort of feminine practice of coming together and creating art from this collective standpoint, which is how the we emerges. I want to talk about the central figure around whom the story, the voices, the we gathers itself, and that is, of course, Sappho. You say, the first thing we did was change our names. We were going to be Sappho, and Sappho has such an immense sort of mythological force across the history of, if I can use a term that's maybe not totally stable, but kind of describes the book, like female creation, feminine creation. She has so much gravity. She's both real and entirely fictional, and there's the fact that only fragments of her exist, which is just so unbelievably sexy for people. And there are so many contemporary female poets that have really returned to Sappho and adopted her voice. So why Sappho? What is she doing here?
Yes, I think you're right that there's an allure to the fragment, and that is part of the draw. But we also have to remember, I think, that there's no poet who would want her or their poetry broken up into 1,000 crumbled pieces and lost over the century. So the fact that we inherit these fragments, and that also people like René Vivienne inherited these fragments, is a part of the material, is part of the materiality of literary history. Maybe not what Sappho herself would have wanted. I imagine she would have wanted whole songs, to be transmitted. But I think also, in the Western canon, if we had a quiz in this room and it was like, okay, let's all name the many myriad, women artists and writers who we could all look back to as great inspirations in the Western canon. I mean, I don't know how many of you would pass this test, but it would be like, well, there's Sappho, and then there's and I think that has made. I mean, there's something tragic about that. Whatever you feel your lineage is, whenever you feel that there's a gap in your intellectual and emotional and cultural genealogy, that you would like people to have come before you, that you could say, oh yes, of course, well first there, and then there, oh, and also, I mean, I don't know, I think that's the way it should be, but it's not always the way it is. And so I think for people who would like there to be more precedents, who are like Sappho, there are not so many, and that makes Sappho in this sort of tragic way very precious. Whether you look at Sappho and you think of her as a woman who wrote, whether you think of her as a woman who who let's say lived in a school of girls, or lived in a community of women, whether you think of her as a queer figure, whether you think of her as someone who was in the tradition of song as well as poetry, whether you think of her, I don't know, as someone who was sent into or was in exile, and that's a model, or someone who was Greek, or someone who lived on an island. I think there are a lot of ways of looking, but because, or you're a poet looking for another beautiful poet in the past, it could be that. But I think, yeah, it's made her precious for many people coming out of different lineages. And if there were more Sapphos, she would be one among many. But when you look at the halls or the facades of buildings with the white marble busts on them, if there's one white marble bust of a woman, it's probably Sappho.
But there's something about the fact that there's so little of her that remains, that we've only received fragments, that makes her so open to any adoption, any interpretation. One can read oneself into her writing from any sort of perspective, any identity, any perspective. And that's why she's constantly returned to by the different wees who are grasping for her and seeing themselves in her and claiming this heritage from her. I want to speak a little bit more about the role of the fragment itself, because this book is really formally interesting for those who read it. It has no plot. It's sort of chronological, kind of. It's written in vignettes, slices of life, images, glimpses, fragments, perhaps. Were you informed by your experience of reading the fragments and by the fragment as a sort of literary style or genre as you were writing this?
So the short answer to this question is Anne Carson. So
excellent. We can go home now.
I mean, Anne Carson is in English the one, but for me, really a brilliant translator of Sappho. So her book, If Not Winter, is like the understory of this book. And she's also, besides being a translator, she's also a poet and an essayist. And I mean, her idea of Cassandra in Cassandra Float Can is where, and her writing on Virginia Woolf. Anyway, Anne Carson is the short answer, but the long answer is, when I first read Anne Carson, I didn't first read her Sappho translation. I read one of her older books called Short Talks. It's a little tiny book. Anyway, she writes short talks on on all these things. They're very short. And I wanted to be Anne Carson. Sadly, for me.
As we all do, yes.
I don't know that everybody does, but I did. Sadly, I'm not.
I do. Raise your hand if you want to be Anne Carson.
Nobody else has to, but it's something I want to. Well, it's nice to meet you, the other Anne Carsons in the room. But I wanted to be able to at least imitate her short talks. And because I'm not a poet and I'm not Anne Carson, that was a failure. But out of the failure came these sort of fragmented forms that I thought, oh, well, at least I could use. I mean, it's a failure, and it's sad that I'm not Anne Carson, but at least I could use these to make something, to kind of like almost twist them together into a. Think about this verb in Italian, intrecciare, which means to like interweave, like if you were making a wreath or something, or intergarland, intertwine. So I realized if I made fragments, I could intertwine them into something, as you said, doesn't really have a plot, doesn't actually like completely chronologically move forward, but isn't intertwining. So it's a kind of collective that is woven together. And the only other thing I want to, this is my tradition of telling people in this room, but I do want to say that one of the things that I really relied upon when I was like twisting things together, besides the fragments of Anne Carson, is all the scholarship and the work that has come before. And I would just like to mention Suzette Robichon, who is in the front row on this side, who has done so much work to preserve and cultivate, for example, not only, but also the legacy of Natalie Barney. And it's without that kind of work, I would not have been able to I would have nothing to twist together. And so I just wanted to acknowledge my debts.
As you should, because as we learned from this book, writing and biography is this collective process that the we is sort of in this room too. It comes from the work of so many different biographers. I think we should turn to some of the lives that you're twisting together. And in particular, I want us to look at Paris. At Paris in the 1910s, 1920s. We're celebrating the library's 1920s heritage this week. So this is particularly meaningful for us. For those who haven't read the book, it actually begins in Italy in the sort of end of the 19th century, and then we're thrust violently into modernism and everything that it brings with us. So we're going to do a quick reading of some of the lives that we learn about in this book, and then we'll talk more about these wonderful women.
This is great because it's one of the parts with Natalie Barney, which I just mentioned, I owe in part to Suzette. This is from chapter 6, and it begins with Romaine Brooks, La Maison. Romaine Brooks spent her youth in Rome learning to paint sharp grey forms like her own body. She did not see why the class on drawing nudes from life should be filled with only young men. She had charcoal and a steady hand. Therefore, she enrolled and ignored everyone but the model. She could not prevent her classmates from remarking aloud on her person how odd and lanky she was, but she began to wear a top hat that shadowed her eyes. At the Scuola Nazionale d'Arte, she got high marks in silhouettes, live nudes, and the first year of poetic meter. After the first year, they stopped reading Sappho, and Romaine Brooks failed literature. Natalie Barney spent her youth in Paris, where her mother was learning to paint. Left to herself, Natalie did what she liked, namely writing poems and meeting girls. One summer, she met Eva Palmer, whose long red hair was like a poem Natalie Barney wanted to write. It fell down to her ankles and hung there irresistibly. In the woods, they took off their clothes to read Sappho, declined nouns naked in the leaves. They lived together in a vermilion cloud in Paris until Eva went off to Greece and married someone. It wasn't until the war that Natalie Barney met Romaine Brooks, who painted all in shades of dove and steel. Natalie thought Romaine could be trusted, more or less, to stay in places like Paris, where the light was constant and muted. Romaine glanced coolly at Natalie and began to paint her grey before a window, wintry, wrapped in a fur. On the desk at Natalie's elbow was a small jade statue of a horse, prancing over the pile of Natalie's poems. Romaine titled the portrait, The Amazon. Then she left Paris for the ochre and azure of the south. Pauline Tarn, born 1877. Violently, Pauline Tarn had extinguished her name. Plain, practical Pauline and flat, yawing Tarn. She burnt them up in a piercing blue fire of her repulsion and then left swiftly for Paris. Her new name would be inky and enigmatic, she vowed. She would make poems like night-blooming violets and emblazon her new name above them. There would be no more Pauline who ate supper, no more Miss Tarn who darned stockings. Instead, she would consume nothing but the evening air and stitch together only ragged fragments of verses. She took a room on the Rue Crévaux and acquired Ragon's Grammaire grecque, bound in elegant green leather. Soon she was piecing together phrases from the Aeolian. By 1899, she was reclining on one elbow in a black frock coat and broadcloth breeches, reading Sappho. In the lamplight, she looked like a sleek, dark line. She had become Renée Vivien. Renée Vivien, 1899. Renée Vivien barely had a youth. What few years she had were in Paris writing poems and studying Greek. She wouldn't eat, she wouldn't sleep, she wouldn't go out in the daytime. She would only translate Sappho into French. One evening, in the autumn of 1899, when the horse chestnut trees were bare of leaves, somewhere between fragments 24a and 31, she met Natalie Barney. Sappho, fragment 24a. You will remember, Sappho writes, for we in our youth did these things, yes, many and beautiful things. It is true that in the velvety bloom of our youth we met Natalie Barney, but Natalie Barney met everyone who caught her eye. She went riding in the Bois de Boulogne in the mornings, wrote steadily all afternoon by the window, and then settled in her salon to receive us, first in Neuilly with Eva Palmer, gracious by her side, and later at 20 Rue Jacob, which was famous for Natalie alone.
Thank you so much, Selby. I'm so glad that we could read this passage because I think it demonstrates so many things. It reveals the place of the we as the sort of intertwining mechanism throughout these different lives coming together. We see the role of Sappho's fragments as you're piecing the story together, and we see how deeply imaginative and embodied your biographical style is. You're not just giving us dry facts. You know, Natalie Barney was born on this date at this time and went on to do this thing. You're giving us the texture of the lives, and it's so striking. And the second thing that's so striking about your portrait of Paris at this time is, first of all, you have an A-list cast. We have Gertrude Stein in it. We have Sarah Bernhardt in it. But we also have we have Natalie Barney in it, but we have other figures that might be lesser known to those who haven't sort of studied this period more in depth, such as Renée Vivien, such as other figures whose names I haven't written down. But what we don't have are men. They are largely absent from this portrait of Paris, and that's very different from the usual picture we receive of Paris at this period of sort of artistic production. Can you tell us a bit about your decision to give us this image of the women of Paris and tell us what these women were doing in this period, what Paris looked like for them?
I doubt I could tell you what all of the women were doing, but I could try to tell you why. Yeah, this is a question I get a lot. Why? What happened to all the men? So they're safe. They're fine. They're still existing in history, and I think that's important. But this is not a history. It's a reimagining. So I just felt like, and I think I'm not the only one who feels this way, that sometimes when you inherit a history in which the same kind of person is always in the center of is always consuming all the air in the room, is always in the center of the story, is always the one who tells what happened and what it means and what's important about it, whatever that is for you, if you feel like, yes, there's the person again. That same kind of person is always in the middle of the stage, being the important one. I think you develop a little desire to temporarily reimagine what would it be like, just as a hypothetical. What would it be like if you yourself took out something that seems like it's always the most important thing, it's always the center of the history, and you just changed it a little bit so that the other people that maybe you also care about had room to breathe for a minute, had space in this imaginary stage in your mind. They actually, like, then you could think about, and this maybe is what happened to me. It's like once you do that, you start to have space yourself to think like, oh, and what did they? I wonder how they felt about that, and I wonder what they, if they didn't learn it from the received lineage that we're always hearing about, maybe they had other important relationships. Maybe they would have made something that was important for them, that maybe they wouldn't have been called all the time by the names of other people. Maybe they could have, I don't know, traveled or learned or created or explored or made their own mistakes, or been in circles with people who maybe didn't dominate the circles in the same way. And so I suppose in a way the reason I can't tell you, what was everybody doing in Paris, although I guess we could say they were in, many of them were in overlapping circles, often around not only, but often around Natalie Barney and around figures like Gertrude Stein as well. And certainly in the, in the world of this library and in the more famous, sort of world, or maybe I shouldn't say more famous now that you told me that Gertrude Stein defected to this library. I didn't know that until tonight. But
from Shakespeare & Co., if you must know.
Yes, I had just learned that.
We won.
Yes, so that was new to me. But yeah, the world of Shakespeare & Company and the world also of Adrien Monnier. Yeah.
But I think something we can say about these women, you're right that we can't know what every woman in Paris is doing at that time, but you're talking about giving them this sort of imaginary breathing space, but they were very much creating spaces for themselves too, through the forms of the salons. And what they were doing in the salons, it's twofold. On the one hand, they were really, it seems to me from reading this book, they were looking at one another and they were seeking ways to represent one another through painting, through dance, through writing.
Yes.
They were also sleeping together. So let's talk about both of those things. First the looking, then the fun stuff.
Yeah, well, I don't think they're, I'm not saying they're the same thing, but they're forms of being in relation. They're forms of seeing someone and cherishing them, let's say, right? So to be close to someone, to be intimate with someone, to truly see someone, to try to represent someone as they are, or as they might like to be seen, or as you see them, that is a gift to the world. I don't know, and it's true, as you say, some of them did both, like Romaine Brooks and Ida Rubinstein. So Romaine Brooks painted Ida Rubinstein, and they were also lovers for a while. So some people overlapped in those ways. But I think maybe it's useful to say that there was a multitude and a variegation of relations and forms of intimacy, and also ways that people identified. I'm not sure that everyone in this book would now identify as a woman, and they had different, people had different words, Sapphic, invert, words we don't use very much anymore, words that were sometimes pathologizing. They didn't have some of the words that we have now, and I think I try to treat with respect what we can know, but I think there are things I can't know or say or decide, and the range of identities and relations, gender, sexuality, not only, is complex, and so it's part of the interweaving of like who was painting who and who was sleeping with who is also bound up in that.
What does it mean to paint? What does it mean to sleep with someone sort of in this time? Yeah. It's so compelling. The book, at the same time as being this remarkable biography, is a sort of history of the legal and political invention of lesbianism, of same-sex relationships within a sort of codified system. And these women, if we can even call them women, these people had such a different relationship to gender, and you realize while reading it that the understanding we have today of gender and of sexuality is not fixed. It has a historical lineage, and it's changing around us as well.
Yes, very true. And in some beautiful ways. I'm always for there being more possibilities. If people want new names for themselves and new categories and new forms of being embodied, I'm pro. In the end of this book, I wanted I don't know, I wanted Lina Poletti to be somebody who would say, yes, when people change names, you know, I called them by the names they asked to be called by. When people change their genre, I followed what they asked for, and that's important to me politically.
And in the book, changing names is, everyone's changing names all the time. We start with changing our names to Sappho.
I'm sorry, it's so confusing, yes.
But I do think naming itself as a political, personal and artistic gesture is so central to the book itself. I'm wondering if you could speak more, maybe introduce us to Lina for those who don't know her, and then talk about how that's inspired this larger reflection upon what a name is and how that shifts as well.
Yeah, I can do that. I might do it backwards though. So I think, particularly if you are, let's say, socialized as a woman, very often, you know, you begin by being given the name of your father, and you very often then are expected to go on and acquire be taken in under the auspices of the name of your husband. And I think perhaps in one of the more striking examples in early European feminism is this person, Sibilla Aleramo, who was an Italian woman who was born Rina Faccio, and started writing when she was young, and she used to make anagrams of her name and publish anonymously so that her father wouldn't know that she was a writer. And then she was a survivor of sexual violence when she was quite young, and she ended up married off to the man who was the perpetrator, and then she was Rina Faccio Pierangeli. So she acquired this sort of chain of a name of this, you know, it's quite horrible if you think about it. And at a certain point, she left. And this was astonishing. You couldn't do this in the early 1900s in Italy. If you were married and you had a child, it was impossible to leave, to divorce. And she changed her name, and she became Sibilla Aleramo, and she wrote a book that was kind of autofiction, proto-autofiction. It's kind of her life, and it's kind of fictionalized, called Una Donna, which is a woman, and she meant it in some ways to be her life, but also to stand for other women as a sort of condition, as a systemic condition of women. And in doing that, she made a kind of paradigm, and she became, you know, quite famous, actually. And then this is how I'm getting back to Lina Poletti. Then she went to a feminist conference in Italy, and Lina Poletti, who knew who she was, this famous feminist writer, you know, sort of picked her up in the conference, and then they were together for some time. So that's another reason why I should have known who Lina Poletti was before this, and I didn't. Nobody taught me who was Lina Poletti, which was sad for me. But I think that Sibilla Aleramo and Lina Poletti also, Lina is a kind of nickname or pet name for her. She was born Cordula Poletti, and she you know, at a certain point for convenience ended up having to marry someone who was a childhood friend, who's one of, I would just want to say, one of the, who's a man in this book. It's a whole, I mean, he's not the only one, but I think he's a feminist.
He's a great man. He's a good...
he writes about
he's allowed in the club.
How can he be a better feminist, and how can he support in solidarity? And I wanted him, he has his own section in this book. Thank you, Santi Muratori.
We have our token man, we're good.
Sorry, I didn't mean to tokenize, but yeah, I just realized that. Thanks.
Well, I think Lina's story is so interesting and so central to this book. And as you were talking about this, about the fact that no one had taught you about her and these discoveries that you made, I think it's an opportune moment to point out, as I look at the clock and realize I'm running out of time, just the immense, extraordinary research that you put into this book. When you all read it, after you've bought it, just after this event, you will read the bibliographical note and see the extent to which you have been in the archives, uncovering so many lives. It's astonishing how many voices populate this book, how many stories there are. Now, I have time for one more question, and I want to return us to modernism a bit, and the question of biography, because as we're reading this book, the question, I'm using we because that's the theme for tonight, the question we're constantly asking is sort of, what is the biographical project here? And we learn as the we develops and sort of becomes we learn the we has been inspired by another biography, another biographical project. Now we're discussing modernism. The best thing, arguably, that came out of modernism, or perhaps the reason modernism happened, is Virginia Woolf. And you're very inspired by Orlando as a biographical project. And you write, for those who haven't read Orlando, it's amazing. It starts many hundreds of years in the past and then takes us straight up to the present. It involves gender changes and changes in time and everything else. And you say in this book that everything begins to become everything at once. And this is sort of what happens to the we, too. The we becomes everything, everyone, and the we becomes both past and present. So can you tell us about how you have sort of adopted the project or method of Orlando to write this new biography of the past and present?
I could try. I mean, I think, I don't know, one way to answer this question is that I started reading Virginia Woolf when I was young, and I just never really recovered from that in a good way. I mean, I think, yeah. So like the we in this book, you know, I was a young reader and looking for people, writers in particular, who had already gone before, who had already like wrenched things out of language in beautiful ways, and for me that's Virginia Woolf. And Orlando, you know, you described it as a biography, and she sometimes does describe it as a biography, but it's also, you know,
it's entirely fictional. Yeah.
I mean, it has pieces, has shards of the life of Vida Sackville West, and it has imaginaries, and it has complications, and kind of romps, and wild flights of fancy, especially towards the end. And at the very end, the book Orlando, you know, begins to tell that it will end that it will end itself on the day when it is published. And so it's writing its own. It's writing this life, and it's full of love and wit and some mischief and flights of imagination. And then it starts to tell when it will end, and it does end. Exactly, it coincides with itself. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but I thought that was quite brilliant. Orlando has many lives, and I like the idea of many lives. And I wanted, or I think maybe didn't know what I was doing, but I found that when I was trying to write a life of Lina Poletti, which doesn't exist, which was, I think, why isn't there a biography of Lina Poletti or an archive of Lina Poletti? Anyway, that was my feeling of lack. I wanted there to be, and there wasn't. So this is what I made. I wanted her to have many lives and to go on, and to, you know, to me she's a political figure, and I wanted her to go on with us in this time when we need political beacons. And I'm a great admirer of contemporary transfeminist movements, and I guess when I go down into the streets, into the piazzas, I wanted the spirit of Lina Poletti to be with me, and so I put some transfeminist slogans from Nonna Di Meno, which is an Italian transfeminist collective, in the mouth of Lina Poletti. So she says, you know, in the end, she says, "Insieme siamo partiti, insieme torneremo," which is we have left, together we departed. Together we shall return. We shall not leave anyone behind. No one will be left. No one is disposable. And that's the feeling that I have when I guess that's an Italian thing, I go down into the piazza, but and so that's where she comes, Lina Poletti to me comes into the present and goes into the future with us, I hope.
Can we have a round of applause, please?
Can I say Sorry, I just wanted, this is I hope, the end of my tradition of just saying people in the front row, but I can't not say, sorry, last one. In the front row is half of the people who made this book possible, and that's Ellie Miller from Gallybeggar, who's the person who said, "Wait, has somebody published that? We might want to publish your novel." And I was like, "Wait, novel? You publish? Do you mean me, my novel?" And I can't. I know it wasn't really my turn, but I just can't say, like, we should have a round of applause for Ellie, frankly.
it's a community, always. It's always a collective we. We all made this together. So thank you so much for sharing these remarkable lives, these remarkable stories with us tonight. We have time for questions now, so we'll start with our in-person audience. And if we have time, we'll look at our Zoom chat as well. So raise your hand very high if you're here in person, and Emma will bring you the microphone.
Thanks. I was struck by your description of performers and what they're giving to audiences and how audiences are receiving it. So how can we, collectively, as performers, as audiences, and as host institutions, how can we best prime audiences to receive what performers have to give?
Wow, what a beautiful question. I guess I'm gonna think about what I've learned from artists in the room, and think about the way that I have watched artists I admire prepare spaces by, we live in a very frenetic, chaotic, troubled world, and our phones are constantly making noises at us. And I think there's a lot to be distracted by and a lot to worry about. And I think about how it's possible for artists to make a space that is more tranquil, that is more caring, that is more collective, that is more like a circle, less, I'm saying this sitting here, facing you, but maybe less like ranks of people who receive and person who professes, and more like what can we all bring to this space when we're sitting together. And so I guess, I would actually refer this question to artists in the room, frankly. But that's my best guess. That's what I've experienced, is that there are people who can say, okay, now we temporarily, not always, forever, we just temporarily close the doors on the world that is always worrying and gnawing at you, and that always wants a lot of your time and attention, and that would like you to to not be able to focus or to be with other people. And we make a space and a time where we can all just be a bit, and then think, what can we bring and what can we receive, and how can we be together? I think it's work. I'm sorry to say that part at the end. I think it's at work, so.
I was struck by how much you talk about translation in the book, and I wanted to hear a bit more about that. I liked the idea of translation as like a journey, and yeah, I just would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, wow, translation. I am in general in awe of translators. I've tried to translate. It's not been a success, and I think it's really a gift to be able to, it is like a journey, or maybe it's like walking with someone. Like you begin in a place with this thing, and in the process of walking with it, really step by step, maybe slow, step by step, both of you are sort of transformed along the way. And when you arrive at the destination, you've walked this whole path together with the text. I think, at least that's the way that I understand it from having sort of failed at it. But it's like accompanying not just an idea, but also a voice across a divide of kinds of words, and also kinds of cultures, and ways that things can be said or can't be said, or what's funny. And I think what's musical in what sounds, what things sound like in ears that are accustomed to hearing one kind of language or another. And also, I guess, in this book, I thought of it as a kind of relation. So sometimes historically, some of these people didn't meet each other, but sometimes they were reading each other, or they were reading a translation of each other, or somebody promised to translate a little bit for them, and that's a passage as well. It's a kind of intimacy, to be in as a kind of transition to be in relation to a text that way, or to be a writer in relation to a reader, with this also interlude of change, of transformation. I would just say again, like, I don't know if you ask that because you're a translator or you read translations, but I think it's, it's one of those, I used to say in French maybe like it's a métier, like it's a craft, it's a calling. I think translation is one of those métiers.
Hi, thank you for your talk and for your book. I was wondering that since when we kind of start to dig through the history of women and people that we would have liked to have learned about earlier, it doesn't end. There's a lot to bring forward. And were there any hard choices that you made when choosing which people to give space to and which environment to shed lights on here?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I don't even know if choice is the right word, but I keep these little notebooks. I have very scribbly handwriting, and so I was keeping, notes of like drawings also. I mean, I don't draw really, but I was just trying to sketch out like the interrelations that were historically true, and then that I also imagine like the relation through translation, or who's reading who, or people who were thinking about the same thing in different places or from different angles. To me, that's also a kind of relation, even if you haven't met. If you're coming from a direction and you think something is important and you're really considering it, to me that's being in relation as well with someone who, for their own reasons, are also reflecting on this. So when I was drawing these relations, at a certain point, my notebook is not that big. It just went off the page. The plenitude of possibilities, especially as you said, Emily, in this time in Paris around Natalie Barney in particular. You make these drawings with these arrows, and then the arrow, then you have to cross out this arrow and put another arrow here, and then you're like, in the bottom of the page, and you think, oh, but who else? And then it's how do you have to just keep adding pages. I guess one hope I have, part of this book came out of my frustration or sadness about there not being more about Lina Poletti. So whatever, Lina Poletti was like the thing I was into. But I hope that, my book is very limited in its own ways. I'm a limited particular person. I only speak, some few languages. I'm white, cis, bi, American woman. So, I have like my own, I couldn't do everything. I can't tell the story of everyone. That would not be good. But what I hope is that that it was something that I made, and that it has gaps that people will say, oh, do you know what, somebody should write, but you know what's missing from this? Or you know what this suggests to me? Or she didn't even think about this, but I could. Or I'm in love with something else. Or like, you would say in Italian, chi se ne frega, like who cares about Lina Poletti? But you know what I'm into, and I hope that this book leaves open those spaces. I don't even know what those spaces would be. This was what I could make, but it's not in any way complete or totalizing. It's got a lot of room on all sides, and maybe even in the center, for other people to make what they want as stories that should be told in those spaces. I hope that happens. I hope people will come back to me and say, oh yeah, I read your book and it was nice or whatever, but it had this space in it for me, and I made something out of it, and that would be absolutely lovely for me.
We have time for a final question.
Yeah, I'm going to be annoying, but it's true. I was thinking of Sibylla and Sybil Bedford, actually. But actually, someone told me about Sybil Bedford after I told them about your book. And then I started reading her, and I thought it was very interesting the way she wrote her own life story, also in a very modern, her own style. So I was wondering if you had looked into her at all, or if you'd that's it.
This question is a perfect example of the question right before, which is like no, but what are you doing this year in your life? Because I think as I said, I'm so limited, and I like it when people say, you must have thought about this, and I think, Yeah, probably should have. Yeah, probably should have done that. But it seems like an opportunity for someone else who made this connection, who saw this as a possibility, as a relation, to take it in their own direction. It sounds like I'm joking. Like, what are you doing with the next year of your life or whatever? But I'm kind of not joking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selby, for this brilliant conversation. It's such a pleasure to have
Thank you
you
very
tonight.
much, Emily, for having this conversation with me.
Of course. And thank you, everyone who came out tonight as well to witness this in person or over Zoom. If this was your first time at the library, welcome. First of all, we've been in operation for over 100 years, and many of the women who are in this book were also figures involved in library activity while these wonderful salons were taking place. So take a moment to look at our beautiful collection. You can find us online as well if you're curious about our history and our heritage. And finally, as I said, this conversation is part of a larger festival we're hosting this month, spotlighting traditions in the musical and poetic arts. So tomorrow, we'll be hosting some absolutely brilliant composers and librettists as they speak about their work in both contemporary opera and philanthropy, and the role that music has sort of in constructing the contemporary political artistic moment that we're all living in. So I highly encourage you to attend as well. And next week we'll be hosting our current writer in residence, Patricia Lockwood, for both a discussion of her work and a little seminar style workshop as well. So please do take a look at our program calendars. And finally, we are an independent nonprofit institution, so our ability to host brilliant speakers like Selby tonight is so dependent upon the support that we receive from our audience. If you're able to donate tonight, thank you so much in advance for your generosity. Please go purchase a copy of this brilliant book, and I will see you all back this time tomorrow. Have a great night.
Thank you.